Okay, I'm sorry for getting a little bit too excited at the very start of this seminar, because now we're going to have the panel discussion, and otherwise we would have missed 3 fantastic presentations. So what I'd like to do to get started is for the panel, the speakers to, first of all, the 3 speakers to come up and get their mics, and then also the 2 Audun Kristjansson from the Icelandic Coast Guard, who was a very, very deep operational experience of the crisis, to please come up and get mic'd up. Is this yes. That's the procedure? And also Eva Bjarnadottir. Where's Eva? Ah, hello. So if everyone could just come up and we can... The first thing I'm going to ask is... Oh, excuse me, I'm sorry. And also our Lithuanian colleague, yeah, please, from the Vilnius University to come up. I think this might take a moment, so just ask for your patience before we... Yeah. It's like, I guess, 2... This is very fancy from my experience, I must say. So I might, if it's okay, ask Eva when we're ready to go. Do you mind, would you like to respond to the overall conversation and give your impressions of what you heard and the presentations, and also to give us a flavor of your own views? But if it can just be quite short, if you don't mind, and then we can move to Audun for his operational experience. And then I would invite first the 3 presenters to respond if they wish, and then we will open it up to a broader conversation. So is everyone okay with that approach? Okay. So you ready to go, Eva? So I would invite you now to begin our conversation, and it'll be, because we're a small group, as interactive as possible. So the floor is yours, Eva.
Thank you for inviting me here. I work for UNICEF Iceland, and we've been working with refugees here in Iceland, and did a small study this year on their experiences of the children, and also from an administrative point of view. I also taught here at the university, taught a course in the political science department on people who have to flee their homes. So my point of view is sort of heavily focused on the people themselves who have to leave their homes. But I will try as my best to respond to what has been said here. So I really appreciated all your different talks, and it was very informative in many ways. And I also appreciate that you're here in Iceland. I think we really are lacking in more detailed discussions on the experiences of the past few years, and also how to move forward from that experience. I agreed with Maria when she said that this is not a European crisis. This is a crisis of other regions in the world where Europe is experiencing some of the consequences. Also, when Jana, that's correct, Jana said that in many ways the responses that we've seen are the core of it is that we are protecting Europe as we know it. So I think we need to keep that in perspective, that we are protecting a very privileged position in the world. And that is not necessarily wrong, but we need to keep that in perspective. Also, when Roderick said, and I really agreed with that, when he said that we need to learn from others, and this experience really showed us the limits of Europe, and that we need to sort of keep our views much broader and see what others are doing in the world and how we can cooperate. So in a sort of also, when you were speaking, I also saw that we have like a microcosm of this here in Iceland. So the experience of Europe can be sort of reduced into the small experience of small Iceland, where almost no refugees come here, but still we had considerable problems receiving those who have come. So I will speak just very shortly. Do I have more time? Is it okay?
I feel you're coming to a conclusion.
Yes. Okay. Sorry. There was such a interesting talks, but so from like I will speak from a human rights perspective. That one of the problems, the main problems we've had here is the arrival of unaccompanied children. So that's a huge problem. It's a huge crisis. But the thing is that we only have 6 to 10 at a time. So 6 to 10 children unaccompanied in Iceland at each time. And this is a huge crisis where we are actually not respecting the rights of these children, and their care is almost non-existent. So for me, this is really representative of this is not a crisis. You know, this is a problem that we can solve. It's easily solved, and the crises are not the arrivals of the children. It has more to do with how we see foreigners and how we see people who arrive in our country in illegal ways. So it has to do with, of course, also capacities within our administration, the understanding of human rights. It has to do with cooperation between different systems, but it also has to do with willingness and prioritization. And this has, the prioritization and the willingness has to do with the idea of protecting Europe and protecting our privileged position, that we don't want to rock the boat, we don't want to change our societies. And we also come to the limits of Europe when we are receiving unaccompanied children, because in my work, my main job has now been to educate people on the best interest of the child. It's a part of the Convention of the Rights of the Child. So, and in that, we need to connect with the world. We need to learn from others. We need to understand where the children are coming from. We need to be in physical contact with the countries of transit and even countries of origin. We need to understand the problem, the core of the problem, and we need to create a human rights-based approach. So just to end this, the main sort of scare of the whole thing has been populism, and this has also been with the unaccompanied children, even though only 6 to 10 at each time in the country, it even these few children will sort of create a scare. I feel that I've also learned through my work with the government and with the children that populists and populism feeds on the sort of harsh or no response. So no response and not doing anything is sort of feeding the divide and feeding the populism, whereas creating good practices is actually the answer. And this is sort of, it has been really sort of weird to say, because actually this is counterintuitive to our government. We need to sort of say or tell them that actually you need to create better practices, you need to create better care for children, and then you will sort of create better situation for the government and less populism.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed, Eva. The issue that I hope we'll get to in the discussion is, if we're thinking about the best rights of the child, at one point in the Western Balkan crisis, there were 8,000 unaccompanied minors who went missing. We simply lost track of them altogether. What happened to those children is not a nice thought to go to bed with at night. And so in the discussion, not now because we're going to hear from Audun right away, I would like to maybe, if we could draw out, well, what's in the best interests in the child? I mean, and if you can help us get deeper into that, my instinctive reaction would be that they don't travel unaccompanied or perhaps don't travel at all, if you know what I mean. So maybe you could explore that. I would now like to move on to Audun, who's been waiting patiently, someone who knows exactly this situation from an operational point of view and can bring us further into the realities of that. So we're all very eager to hear about your experiences supporting the EU's search and rescue missions in the Mediterranean under Operation Poseidon, and which is, of course, off the coast between Greece and Turkey, and Operation Indalo, which is in the Western Mediterranean, where the EU supports the efforts of Spain. Please, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to be here. I have maybe a little bit different element than you have, and less academic, more operational. The Icelandic Coast Guard has been participating in Frontex joint operations since 2010 in different regions. We have been in Greece in joint operation Poseidon, in Italy in different operations. They're always changing name of these operations there, in Indalo, and in Hera in Senegal as well. So I was a crew member on our fixed-wing aircraft for 4 years when we were there. But since then, since 2012, I have been managing our communication with Frontex and our operation in this region. So I think Iceland's contribution to the migrant crisis is quite significant, and as normally with small states, it's my feeling that small state contribution in Frontex joint operation is relatively high and larger than the bigger states. If we take, for example, Germany, our contribution last year was the same as Germany would have 77 aircraft the whole year in Frontex joint operations. But of course, they are doing something else which we are not doing, but in the field I've been working in. So, and we are having the similar contribution as the Scandinavian countries. Our contribution is not only in form of surveillance and rescue assets deployment. We are the smaller states are operating quite efficiently. They are quick. They have a short decision channels, so they can actually gain quite a lot and act fast. And we have also gained a lot from these operations. Before 2010, we were only operating here in Iceland. We were mainly doing fishery surveillance, no border surveillance, so we have gained a lot from this experience and a lot of knowledge. But our actually main result is that the small states can have a huge effect in this crisis, and I think we are doing that along with other small states which are operating in this region.
And do you mind if I just cut in to ask you, can you describe the surveillance work that you do, the aerial surveillance work? How does it work actually in the Mediterranean?
It's different between areas. For example, in August and September, we were doing surveillance out of Malaga in Spain. So we're doing 5 to 6, 7 hours patrol flight between Spain, Algeria, and Morocco. And we are monitoring the traffic coming from Africa to Spain. And if we see a vessel, we report it to Spanish authorities, which send rescue assets on scene to rescue the people. And we look at it strictly as a humanitarian work. We are not policing, actually. We are doing, it's a humanitarian, and we are doing search and rescue. It's similar in different areas. For example, when we are operating south of Crete in Greece, we are monitoring the traffic from Egypt, from the east part of Mediterranean, the traffic going to Italy, and the same in Italy, the traffic from Tunis and Libya up to Italy.
And what type of shifts do the pilots work, for example? How long would they go out to search the area? How long would the pilots be in the sky, doing
Normally we are flying 5 to 6 hours each time, approximately. It can be extended up to 7, 8 hours if we have to be in the area. But additionally to the migrant flow, we are detecting quite a lot of drug trafficking as well, and especially south of Spain. So there are other issues that we are doing as well, fishery control, environmental surveillance. So there are some sub-tasks that we do as well.
And when Iceland was actually had a vessel in the Mediterranean, the Tyr, were you involved with this also? I think so.
I took care of the planning, and And that is one thing with a small state. They have we are used to do things on our own with small crews, and we had been taking part of in creating the standards and procedures for Frontex, for example, for boarding, for example, and that is one contribution that we have put into this concept and these operations.
And just to follow on from the last speaker before I move on again, is when you were rescuing people at sea, you were rescuing some unaccompanied minors as well, I would have no doubt. And what would be the situation then when a child is found at sea? What would be the procedure?
There are standard procedures about how we take care of the people and how we take care of them, and depends on the situation of the people what we are doing actually. And then actually it depends quite a lot on the host country where we are operating in. So there are different procedures in Greece or Italy or Spain, and sometimes we are facing actually difficulties to put the people ashore, because there are some political issues as well. Some nations are not willing to receive the people, and so that was an issue as well. But it depends on the country where we are operating in.
Thank you very much. So we'll move to the next panelist now.
Vitas is good. Vitas.
Sorry, I've been in the bathroom practicing that for an hour and I still haven't gotten any closer to it. And you are with the University of Vilnius.
Yes.
And what's your specialization?
Well, it's political economy.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I invite you now to make a few reactions to the conversation.
Yes, so I will be talking more from an academic perspective, and maybe having in mind the whole project of the book. So one question I had was, so there seems to have been a lot of variation in responses that countries had, right, even small countries. Was that surprising or not, based on the theories that we have, based on past experiences? Should we be surprised by what countries did or not? You know, Sweden took a different approach from Denmark. Why? What are in general our theoretical expectations? How should small countries react in such situations? And then we had these, everyone touched a little bit on it, right? You had geographical differences, you had whether a country was maybe a new member state or an older member state, and so on. What are the best factors in explaining these differences and this variation? And then in the background of all these factors, to what extent is smallness in itself an important explanatory factor, right? So there was also Italy and Spain, which are considered large countries. Did they react differently than the small countries? And if yes, can our explanations, our expectations about small countries explain it? And of course, there was variation in smallness across the small countries, right? So Croatia is smaller than Bulgaria or than Greece. Again, did they react differently? And if yes, can that be attributed to their smallness? And then regarding this, what academics call dependent variable, what we are trying to explain. So different countries, again, I understand that we are trying to, or you're trying to explain different responses, but do we have in mind sort of one dimension where you have more cooperation or less cooperation, or perhaps we have multiple dimensions? I think it would be good to try to put it sort of, have some structure on what are we trying to explain in a way. Then regarding Hungary and Hungary's response, we have this shelter theory that small countries should seek shelter. What Hungary did to me seems sort of a deviant behavior from that perspective. Is that really a deviant case in terms of the sheltering theory? And if yes, what does it tell us about what kind of broader implications does it have? And Roderick touched upon it about large countries acting small and the other way around. And we have these different definitions of smallness ranging from structural to discursive definitions. So because of this crisis, did small countries become smaller or did they become larger? I guess the main issue here is this discursive perspective. So did small states start thinking about themselves as smaller? I guess in one way they became more vulnerable. or maybe they actually showed some initiative, and that's why they started thinking about themselves as actually larger. And finally, I guess, again, from more theoretical academic perspective, it's always good to have in mind, if we are studying a case of something, it's always very good to know what that is a case of. So are we talking about small states dealing with crisis? Are we talking specifically about small countries dealing with migration crisis? And Hugo was talking about some relevant comparisons with maybe Cuban crisis, etc., refugee crisis. Or are we talking about small countries dealing within the EU, right? Because and it's possible to look at these discussions from all these angles, but each of them sort of has different theoretical implications. And if other researchers are going to use these findings, it's always good to have in mind, what is this case of? Because others will be looking at similar cases and will be able to use some implications, some lessons from this research. Thanks.
Okay. So I proposed maybe that we have a brief reaction from the first three speakers, and thank you very much for that last framing already, which saves me a bit of work. So Roderick, you've become rebellious and you've decided.
Am I on duty or not?
You are, because you're one of the presenters. I mean, isn't that a kind of clue that the other presenters are up there and you're sitting there? Yeah. So could I just ask for a brief response? And I'd like to actually, because Audun is our operational expert and we have to make the most of his presence here, I'd actually like to ask one question to you, which is, why would a country like Iceland participate in the crisis so far away? I mean, we know that the moral arguments, we can take them as read. But from your view, as a professional and as somebody charged with, duties in Iceland, etc., what's the benefit of international cooperation, or what are the motivations? Benefit is the wrong way to look at it. So when it comes to your turn to respond, maybe you could include that. And then we'll just start with the three speakers, and Roderick, as punishment, you will speak first now.
Right, okay. And I'm just reacting to what's been said.
Just to if you have any reactions to or you want to add anything from earlier on, but please be brief. Yeah. I know him, so I can do that.
I was in question mode because I was listening.
Or ask questions.
But
yes.
I mean, really, just to find out where the unaccompanied minors come from and why. I mean, why Iceland? So where from, how, and why would be very useful. And on the sort of operational perspective, I was interested by what you said about Iceland sort of affecting Frontex's rules on boarding and so on. There's an interesting tug of war going on inside Frontex, or sort of through Frontex, that frontline member states will call in another country in order to try to acquaint them with how border control works in their country. So last time I was in Greece, we went out on a German Coast Guard ship, and they said, we're not doing anything useful here, but we kind of feel like the point is that we're getting to know how the Greek border works. So has that kind of happened? What have you been able to impact in the way that European borders work, and what have you kind of come away with from your work in the distant Mediterranean? What sort of lessons have you learned that maybe feed back into how you manage borders in Iceland, if anything?
So actually, we can link this to the question if the small countries get smaller or do they get bigger. I think when we are operating in this region, it's easier for a small country to come in, and it's easier for us than bigger nations, because, for example, Greece, Spain, Italy, they do not like to have the bigger nations coming in and to tell them how to do things.
Right.
It's easier for small countries to come in, and we can go the smooth way, and actually it's my experience that we have a voice in this cooperation, and people are listening to what we are saying, and so I think we are bigger than we actually we are in real. We are only 360,000, but we have a voice there, and so we have opportunity to affect standard and procedures, and like I said, we have a voice there. So, and That is quite important, and in that way we have managed to tell our opinion about how to do things, and it has been listened to that.
Can you give me a concrete example that I can sing Iceland's praises with?
How we are operating here, and
Yeah, something that you feel you've affected.
just for example, the boarding procedures. When we started to operate TIR in Mediterranean in 10-11, and we made procedures of how to do boardings on board vessels. When we left, the Swedish Coast Guard came, they took our procedures, we teach them how to do it. They took the procedures and modified them a little bit, and then they brought it over to Norway, and so on. So it's called the Icelandic boarding procedures, and that is one way of doing things.
Okay, so the answer is clear that it's a way of making the international environment more Iceland-friendly and spreading Iceland standards to a degree, influencing the world around you, as well as participating in a necessary humanitarian action.
Yeah, and of course we are taking something from the other nations as well,
Experience.
and to improve our operation as well. And that is one of the reasons why we are doing this. We are gaining a lot of experience and knowledge of how to operate in this environment.
Example?
Roderick, sorry. I mean, I agree you're better at this, but you're going to have to let me do it, I'm afraid, my friend. Maria, can I turn to you now if you want to have any quick reactions, because this is nicer as a conversation.
Yeah. No, just a couple of quick reactions. First, Eva, I thought it was really interesting, and you raised, of course, what I think is one of the most important things to think about, and that is that we're talking a lot about consequence management, how to manage things once we have a large groups of refugees moving around, both inside countries and then across borders. But for small states particularly, I think it's very easy to forget that you also could try to have a voice in terms of preventive activities. How do we actually change the situation in those countries that are exporters of refugees at the moment? And here, I think again that promotion of democracy, human rights, rule of law globally becomes so much more important, actually, in order to also, if you want to call it protecting ourselves from refugee flows. So for small states to rather, again, just back down, step down, and try to close the doors is sort of counter to what could be done if the EU would speak louder. And as, again, Roderick pointed out before, it's not necessarily always working so well for the EU, but I would just challenge you. Compare what the EU is doing in terms of promotion of human rights, democracy, rule of law, compared to what China is doing, compared to what Russia is doing, compared to today what even the US is doing, compared to what Syria is doing, Iran, and so on. So everything is relative, and it's very easy to be critical of what the EU is doing, but check what the others are doing. So, and then if all states, even the small ones, would support more of EU action, we're not going to change the world, but to some extent, and for a lot of other countries, the EU is still their most important trading partner. So there's still a little leeway here where more things can be done, also to kind of stop the flows in the first place. And then just for Vitas, I'm not going to try to have an answer to all your questions now, but we will come back to that later on. But just a couple of reflections, and that is that should we be surprised about the variation in responses from small states? I think not at all. I think the EU's biggest weakness is that it's still too intergovernmental. Governments still have too much individual power, and that is exactly to be expected when it is the governments and not the Commission and not the European Parliament, who are more transnational bodies, are sort of allowed more space in the decision-making machinery.
Well,
governments are chosen. Governments are chosen by the people in one country, and they go when they
not to abuse my position here too much, but
Please do.
If I could introduce the idea that actually, even though I was part of that infrastructure at the time, there wasn't any action the European Commission took that ended up being decisive in the crisis. You might, Dana told us about the need to build up the European infrastructure, the European Border Guard, the EU Asylum Agency, but that will be many years in the future. And in fact, the only decisive steps really were taken by the frontline countries, and I include Germany as a frontline country in respect of the Turkey deal, even though we were fully involved in that for the months in the run-up to it. I'm not saying the EU is...
Can I respond to that?
I think I have to let you, but I just want to be clear about the point I'm making, which is that the EU is a vital, irreplaceable supporting actor. Vital, but it's not... I wouldn't take... If you take the responsibility away from the countries at this moment in time, I would not have the faith that the structures or the mentality is mature enough yet to handle that crisis.
I don't think so either.
But please respond now.
I don't think also they're mature enough for that. That I agree with. But in terms of the Commission is of course not proposing things that the states will not agree to. That would be just, political stupidity. So as long as they have known that a lot of countries did not want to move further in these areas, then of course they will not propose it. So in a sense, I think it's not so easy to say that it's one or the other.
If I may again, I promise I'll move on. The Commission proposed relocation. It was quite an ideological policy, which would not keep Europe united. I mean, you can say it was the right thing to do, and that's the way they did it. They said, we know it's not consensual, but it's the right thing to do, and we're going to fight for it. Which is, whatever you like to say, see it as brave, see it as unwise. They were ideological in that crisis, and that, we saw the consequences. I just think that I wouldn't trust the Commission right now, even though it's still maturing in this area. And I'd like to throw into the debate the parallels with the Eurozone crisis. Actually, and I'm defending your point now, because in the Eurozone crisis, the only institution that really made the difference was a federal one, the European Central Bank. But again, it wasn't a Commission. But anyway, sorry.
But we are talking to someone here who has been working for the European Council, so we also have...
I'm sorry, no. I made an argument that's pretty solid. You can address the argument, but it's not because I'm biased. In fact, the other message is much more popular and easy to make, in my view.
But my point... Actually, I agree with you, but my point was, of course, that member states will, of course, make very different sort of judgment of the situation if they have been elected only in national arenas, rather than those who have been elected in a trans sort of European debate, at least. For good or bad, and then they have to sort of negotiate. So again, I'm not going to get into this.
Finish that
I'm just going to say one really, really short point, and that is, you said, did small states become larger? I think not, because I think, again, the weaker the EU becomes, the smaller the small states in Europe are becoming at the moment. That's a very short answer. I'm not going to...
Okay, no, now I move on to Dana. Dana, do you have anything you'd like to input into the conversation?
Thank you very much. I was trying to memorize all the questions which are being raised because I didn't bring paper with me, but my brain is still fresh. So I would like to comment on Vita's questions. The first thing in common for all small European states during the migration crisis is that they were expecting more agile European Union, and they got fragile European Union. This is the only thing which I find in common for all these small states which were involved in the crisis. And then the different responses were actually based on whether they were transit or recipient states. And then if there were transit states, you can see different regional patterns. So you could see Western Balkan states reacting in a similar way, Visegrad countries or Central European states reacting in a similar way, and so on and so forward. You also raised the question of Hungary, whether its behavior or whether its policies were more deviant than others. I would say that they went to extremes. All the other countries were also opting for individual solution because EU was fragile, not agile, and not proactive, so they needed to do something on their own. They actually were hiding behind the protection of their people, their sovereignty, and so on and so forth. But Hungary had this huge campaign with billboards. Then they had a referenda. They have the entire narrative of securitization of migration crisis. So I think if we can call Hungary a small state according to population, maybe to some other criteria not, but I think they show the most deviant policies during the migrant crisis. So this would be my answer to your question. And the third question you raised, and this is the last I remember, is whether small states are becoming smaller. I think the crisis is the greatest opportunity for small states to become more important. If you have enough good political leadership, if you have enough will and resources to do that. So if you take a look, or if you analyze the entire crisis, there are some small states which became smart states during the crisis because of their policies. And there are some small states which became even smaller because of their anti-immigrant policies. So it depends, you know, how do you act during the crisis.
And how would you characterize Croatia in 2 words?
Indecisive and taking the burden off its shoulders. I would say so.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Do you mind if I abbreviate your name to Vitas? It's my own ignorance.
That's my preference as well.
Okay. So, do you consider your questions well answered, or?
Well, I just have this one because I think it's at the core of the project. Smallness itself, did that have an effect or not? Did Italy react differently because it's large or not? And across those small countries, did they react differently? And if yes, is that because they're small?
But I mean, to me, the answer is based on geography, no?
Well,
situation.
Yeah.
But then it's not smallness itself, right? Smallness itself does not play a role, or does it? I don't know.
It's perfect. Let's pause on that one. I just want to go to Eva for a quick response because so many of the some questions were directly answered to her, and then I'd like to open it up. So if you don't mind being a little bit brief, Eva, you're happy to take the floor now?
Yeah.
Okay.
So Roderick asked about the unaccompanied children. Yes, everything about them. So the group that comes here is, of course, a little bit different from the other countries around us. Mainly because they are usually in their second or third time fleeing. So they are actually going from bad situations in Greece and finding their way to Iceland, coming from camps there, or some situation where they felt they were not secure. And then there's a group coming from the other Scandinavian countries, so Sweden and Norway, most specifically. So they are usually around the age of 18. So they're very close to 15, 16, 17, 18, and of course also 19, 20. So they are around the age of 18 and are in the they're trying to escape a return from the Scandinavian countries, and so they come here. But how, we don't really know much about how, because this is really under-researched area here, and we don't have any. There's one research going on. It's a master's thesis that's going on now.
What do you mean, how they actually arrive?
How they arrive. Of course, they arrive by airplane, but you know, how they raise the money, how they, you know, get the funds to come here. We don't know, actually.
I have this image of Trapped in my mind of people coming off the boat and Seyðisfjörður. You know,
yeah. I mean, I think a couple of them did that, came by the boat. But usually they come by airplane, and we have no idea how.
Sorry, I'm
No, I think you're going to ask what I was going to ask. So.
No, well, probably whatever anyway. But is there? Do you not have debriefers here who talk to people, and if not, can you not pull in the people from the Frontex network to come and chat, or is it harder with unaccompanied minors? I don't know what the protocol is.
I guess the authorities have loads of information that we don't. So as a UNICEF, as a sort of a NGO here, we don't have access to any of it, and they don't publish it in any way. So we only have the information that we gather ourselves with interviews with the children. And we have not gone so far as to discuss the route to Iceland. So we've discussed a lot about their stay in Iceland, but we haven't really discussed their life before that.
And nationalities? What's the
nationalities? It has been in the past few years some Albanian children coming here. They are usually returned. Then we have Somali, Afghan, Iranian, Iraqi. Yeah, that's the main nationalities. you want me to answer the best interest question?
Yes, please, but please be brief, because then I want to take Vitas's question and open it up to the audience. Yeah.
So how do we determine the best interest of the child or unaccompanied children? Of course, if we could say, like, just stay in your home, that would be perfect, but we can't, and they do move, and for loads of reasons. And the reasons are everywhere between domestic violence, gang violence, terrorism, whatever. So they leave their homes for various reasons, and when they are here in Europe, we have an obligation to look into their best interest, and there we need to. The Committee on the Rights of the Child has what's it called? Like general comment on this, how we should do it, and we should look to the views of the children. So we should speak to them. We should look at their family, if we can unite them with their family. So there are loads of things that we need to look into, and that's sort of the method of measuring the.
How do you respond to the difficult moral questions in the debate, especially for children who are close to the age of 18 and their age is disputed? We see loads of those cases in the press.
Yeah, it's a huge issue here in Iceland because the method itself has been criticized a lot. So there's a dental examination. What we have emphasized as UNICEF is that it's not so much the method itself. Of course, that can be really unreliable, and there are some who say that this is scientifically not reliable to do it this way. And we have cases of here that being wrong. But we need to look more at the consequences. So what does it mean to be 18 years old? And here in Iceland, it means that you will be moved from a fairly unsecure premises with no care to a completely unsecure premises with other adults. So you will go as an 18-year-old, 19-year-old to live in a housing and in a room with another adult man that you don't know. And so the consequences of returning 18 is that it's like physical. You will be moved from your secure premises, and then also it also has to do with the decision of if you can get any kind of protection.
Yes, but I would also say an unaccompanied minor, they basically don't get returned. They have much stronger rights as more vulnerable people than. But it's rather arbitrary if everyone is very close to 18 because you don't know. It could be a matter of a few days whether you go home or not.
Yeah, exactly, and that's why UNICEF globally has been sort of trying to push the argument that we need to sort of soften this sort of border of age border, where you need to look at children in a more sort of diverse way.
Okay. I suspect one of the issues that's going to come up in the broader conversation is, well, but what happens then when children are actually encouraged are sent to go, because once they make it, they consent for their parents, but we can't get into that now because I want to open it up to the audience. We have about 20 minutes left. So I propose keep your questions to take 2 quick questions, and then I hope that the panel will answer. Not everyone needs to answer if you don't want to, but they've been standing a long time on their feet, so if your questions are short and punchy, that will give them more energy. So this gentleman here, and maybe just let us know who you are, and then somebody else, and then we go straight.
My name is Anders Wivel. I'm from the University of Copenhagen, and I want to propose an answer rather than a question.
Fair enough. You've been waiting a long time.
It's on the question of smallness and how does smallness factor in to these issues, because I think I agree that is absolutely central. I can see from our discussions this afternoon, and thank you for some excellent presentations. I think it's been very interesting, but I can see at least 2 ways. From our discussions this afternoon. I think the first way that the smallness factors into it is in terms of the action space that you have as a state without systemic consequences. So if you're Germany, you have a very limited space to act without this having systemic consequences. If you're Denmark and Slovenia, it's much wider, the action space you have in your policy. So you can actually do more as a small state without messing up the system and maybe getting away with it. I think the point on Denmark hiding, I think that was a a very good point, actually, and illustrates this point. And I think the second way that smallness factors into it, and that's related to that, that is that the small states, when they do their policies on migration and external relations more generally, they tend to look to what the great powers do. I think that was put also several times in our discussion this afternoon. So if you're a smaller state, you'll actually look to what are the consequences of doing this, not just in terms of migration in this case, but also in terms of our relations with Russia or with Germany or with other strong states in the region. Thanks.
Okay, I think we can take another one, because that was a very helpful intervention rather than a question.
Okay, I don't have short questions. I have long ones.
Can't you cooperate? I mean,
we'll make it short.
Thank you.
From your perspectives, and I think it's really great that we have so different people representing different perspectives here. What do you think was the biggest cost of this flow of refugees, not to call it migrants, and how to proceed from that? Like, there has been several topics that have been touched upon: the rise of populism or unilateral action taken from stateside, the Schengen crisis, or the failure of Dublin regulation. What do you think is one of the biggest problems that has come after the crisis?
That's very clear. Thank you. Another question, and then we go for the discussion. From anyone who is perhaps not one of the researchers or experts? Our Greek colleague. You are definitely an expert, so...
Thank you very much. I would like to ask about the role of Turkey in all this. Is Turkey a trustworthy partner to discuss with, considering the revisionist agenda that Turkey has? And also, I would like to ask if the agreement with, between Turkey and European Union can be considered as a success story.
Okay. Okay, actually that's a very nice question to each person. Basically, what do you think is the biggest fallout from the crisis? What's the biggest consequence, in your view, when you look at it? Audun, do you want to start, since it's not really an operational question, so I'm sorry for that.
One of the consequences, of course, that we have lost of thousands of lives in the Mediterranean, and that is one of the consequences. And
loss of life.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Unprecedented loss of life. It's the world's most deadliest sea, they say. Mm-hmm. But do you have any thoughts on, what that implies for? We saw there was a moral conundrum in that crisis, where the more we increased search and rescue activities, the more deaths came in at the end of the year, and then you would have this debate. Well, it's true, 3,000 people died in 2017. But also far more people managed to enter the European Union and escape poverty or conflict. So this, to me, it's this really, really nasty moral conundrum. If we, what do you have a reaction on that? Or?
Just one thing, that is what we have called the pull factor, that we are sometimes rescuing people within economical zone of Libya, Tunis, and so on. So people are going just 10, 15 nautical miles from the coastline, and then they are calling for assistance, and sometimes we are not able to rescue these people, or the assets we are on scene. So that is one of the effects. And when, for example, in Italy, when they stopped going into the economical zone of the African countries, the flow reduced. So that is one of the effects.
Thank you. That's an interesting perspective, and for bringing that moral conundrum onto the table, because it's at the center of the whole crisis. Dana, do you have a quick response for what was the biggest fallout?
Thank you, Jana, for your question. I think that the biggest problem is that it brought into the surface so many different lines of division in Europe. And within the European Union, so you have the division between small states and big states, east and west, transition recipient states, those who are pro-migrant, those who are anti-migrants, those who cherish more Europe, and those who are for more national states. So I think the divisions which surfaced are the biggest problem of the entire crisis.
So political disunity.
Yes,
and
definitely.
in my study at the end, I kind of say, you know, both the opponents and the proponents of relocation are both itching for revenge in the years to come, and so it's not this feeling of revenge is still there. Will be for the multi-annual financial framework discussions during your presidency. So I definitely think that's a good point. Eva, what is I think I know the answer in one sense, but perhaps you'd like to elaborate.
It's a big question. I think to name one, maybe a loss of innocence, a loss of belief in that we are a part of something great. And personally, I think that we are, but I think we lost some innocence and some inner belief that we were part of something that then wasn't there when we needed it.
But could I draw that out a little bit, because this is the real desire to respond to the crisis in line with European values. I think that's what you're referring to. We're a part of that. But where did that expectation come from?
That's a good question. I guess, Iceland is not even a part of the European Union, but I had that.
Yeah, you're the most pro-European sounding Icelander I've heard.
I think it's more like it's like a nationalistic sentiment. You know, it's we're a part of something that is good in the world, and so compared to other regions, you know, and for good or bad, you know, but still, I think we have all had this, or many of us, we had this feeling of being part of something that was really good. And I think this exacerbated when we saw Germany taking in the refugees. We were like, oh, you know, see how good we are, you know. And then it sort of started crumbling a bit, but yeah.
No, I find it a very interesting point, because the desire to be good, to be humanitarian, was huge at the beginning, but then the Willkommenskultur, it evaporated after New Year's, the New Year celebrations in Cologne in Germany, which were marked by violence.
Yeah, but I think it didn't disappear, and it's actually still huge. You know, there's so many people fighting for this in Europe, so I don't think we need to. Even though the other voices are strong, I really think we need to focus on that we still have a majority for strong European Union and international cooperation, and you know, we're not a minority. You know.
Do you mind if I join you up with Audun for 1 second and say what is your perspective on the non-governmental organisations in the Mediterranean working to very close to the coast of Libya and bringing people up together? No, it's for you, Eva.
For me.
Because Audun mentioned that and how it's a double-edged situation.
Yeah, I believe that.
You support their activities, or?
I don't really have a strong opinion.
Okay.
I just think probably they're doing it with the best interest possible. But if that, I don't know.
No, they're part of the movement that you mentioned.
Yeah.
But actually, to underline it, it was not only not governmental agencies. It was also assets on behalf of Frontex, and so yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. I think we shouldn't. In my mind, we shouldn't devalue these humanitarian responses. They're really important for our humanity and for our future.
Okay. Roderick, you're getting uncomfortable there. I can see you.
No, it's because I want to ignore you, mainly because you pulled me out of having a quiet time, and just respond to what I've heard rather than specifically to that question. If that's right. On the NGOs in the Mediterranean. What we've noticed is that it's not a sort of direct pull factor as people think, but what it does allow is countries of origin, particularly in West Africa, to sort of hide behind a humanitarian narrative that says it's all the EU's fault and responsibility. And we sort of noticed that when the footage of slave markets in Libya came out and suddenly became a political issue in countries of origin, that they were under pressure to repatriate their nationals, to reopen their consulates and so on. So that was the kind of broader thing. It nevertheless requires the EU to take responsibility for the Mediterranean so that it can then say to democracies in West Africa, take responsibility for your citizens. But that, I think, was the broader sort of, the broader humanitarian thing. On the EU getting smaller, I wanted to react to that as well. I think in practical terms, what we noticed a lot when we were doing sort of foreign policy stuff was that actually the EU was taken more seriously. As soon as it started closing borders, countries which had never cooperated with us in the past said, oh, okay, so you've woken up, the loss of innocence. And it was precisely small peripheral countries like Hungary, which had an ambition to go from being policy takers to policy makers, and had missed that boat during the Eurozone crisis when they thought they had something to offer, that they become part of that. So they became bigger as well. So in a sort of strange logic, again, there's something there.
So this is interesting because Dana kind of said that Hungary became smaller, but you think because Hungary was difficult, it became bigger.
I think because because Schengen is anyway odd in that it was outside EU structures and it started in a corner of Western Europe and then expanded, that anybody who joined subsequently in the south and the east took on Germany's rules. And Germany has forgotten what it's like to have borders. So, Hungary or Greece or whoever, you would go and visit them and they'd say, well, this is the Schengen rule book and this is how we do things here. And if the Germans come, then we try to, reacquaint them with the reality of having a border. So I think with the migration crisis, but Germany started listening to Hungary.
But just to be very simple, Hungary might have been difficult and hated by some people, but in fact it was more influential, in a way.
If you want a one-word answer, yes.
Okay. And you don't want to say what's the biggest loss? Because you're not ignoring me, you're ignoring...
No, we're all ignoring Turkey.
So I'm going to come back to Turkey.
All right, well then I'll start.
Because Turkey's a special subject. Do you want to
start with that? No, we've done an excellent question.
Okay. We'll go on. Vitas.
Well, I think it has been mentioned, very deep divisions, polarization across countries and within countries. So Lithuania didn't almost, we almost didn't have any asylum seekers or refugees. We participated in the reallocation scheme, and it was a couple of hundred refugees who then came and basically left for other countries, most of them. But even then in Lithuania, we had really heated debates on that, on something that didn't even happen. So in a counterfactual situation where I would imagine what would have happened had there been a large sort of inflow of migrants, it's quite scary to think about that. It would have had a very deep impact on the Lithuanian political system, very deep polarizations and divisions, and rise of radical right and populism.
But Lithuania chose to accept people,
yes.
Even though it didn't want to.
Yes. I think for the reasons that you mentioned. You mentioned was they just wanted to comply and be good Europeans. Especially having in mind that we will not spend much resources anyway, and there will only be a couple of hundred people. Right? So,
do you mind if I press you even more and say, did they not expect them to stay?
I think it's possible. But I cannot say for sure.
And did anyone stay?
I do not know. I don't know.
But probably very few.
Yes, probably.
And is Lithuania still relocating people today, for example?
I don't know.
No, okay, no.
But I know you're not. I think they're sticking to all the agreements, but not doing anything more than that. So, formally complying to all the agreements.
Okay, I think that's called bandwagoning, is it not, in the literature? Maria, you've been very patient. Would you like to say what you think? I think I know the answer. Is the biggest loss or the biggest fallout from the crisis?
I have two answers, and I think the biggest loss is, and I already said it, I think, again, in a world historical perspective, it's like the most difficult process in statecraft over the last 400 years started about 60 or 70 years ago in Europe, with the attempt, again, to actually not create a sovereign state, but to actually start sharing parts of the sovereignty. And here we have seen states who have just started to roll back that process. So I think that it's very sad that the Schengen is disrupted and we're kind of rolling back the development when it comes to creating a new type of political structure. But that is maybe the political science answers, but also another one would be the lost innocence. I agree very much on that. that
It's a very nice way of putting it.
it is a very nice way of putting it. And I'm thinking, we've all seen, even in TV shows these days, how the US had to deal with the crisis in Cuba when a lot of refugees came to try and enter US waters, and where we had the Coast Guards and others who had to discuss exact rules. What do you do if it's international water? How do you do if it's national water, if they are on the beach compared to out in the water? And we've been thinking that is such a horrible discussion to have to decide for a human being. Do we rescue this person depending on how many meters he or she is from the borderline? And now suddenly Europe also had to start having these discussions, and not only country by country, but also collectively, and start finding out how do we do this.
The US signed an agreement with Cuba that's almost identical to the EU-Turkey deal. But please, go on.
No, so that would have been that, but also on the bigger and smaller. I wanted to, Anders, thank you for your suggestion here that maybe small states can have a bigger leeway. Is that how you put it? And I am not sure if I would have thought about it like that, but maybe that is a possibility. But the relationship here between small states and then what the EU can and cannot do, and coming back also to the EU being smaller or larger, I think my point was not that the EU is becoming smaller in terms of necessarily overall having less policies, but rather smaller in relation to what kind of power it can wield in the international system. So the EU is becoming much smaller in terms of its economic size versus China, versus, well, US is also losing in economic size versus China. Population-wise, and so there are others who are surpassing. So from being one of the, in theory, a superpower, should actually, again, the states choose to use it, to being smaller and smaller in terms of our traditional power measurements. So it was not. So I agree with you on the actual policies. And there was another question that we dodged here somehow. What was it? It was one.
Turkey.
Yes, but I'm actually going to ask the Turkey question now. So shall we move on to that?
Yes.
Because so not everyone will want to answer the Turkey question, I think. So now you can answer the Turkey question.
If not everyone wants to answer, I will
Well,
pass it.
I doubt every single person on the panel is going to.
No, let's move on to the next one.
You are welcome.
No, you're more than welcome.
Okay.
No, a short one. Because as you pointed out before, the EU member states felt that if they couldn't handle the situation in any other way, of course, just like with the US-Cuba, there had to be some deal, and we can all, we all know why it's been criticized a lot. But also it was the only thing the state leaders can think of. And then maybe I can add, coming back to the problem that had the EU leaders earlier on discussed on their own how the EU should deal with that. And there had been discussions, for at least 10 years about strengthening Frontex, and there had been other attempts. But since that, we had states who blocked those discussions. In the end, when everyone entered into sort of a crisis thinking mode, then this was the agreement, and it may be sad and it may be criticized. But I think, in that respect, the fault again, sorry for saying it, is going back to actually the state leaders in the EU who should have.
But the question's actually really tough, because he's asking you to say, well, can it be considered a success? Was the question.
Okay. I have no answer to that.
Okay, fair enough.
Sorry.
She's going to. Maria's taking the fifth on the EU-Turkey agreement. It's a very, very difficult question. Are you taking the fifth on the EU-Turkey agreement? Roderick, you can't take the fifth because you're a foreign policy expert.
Is it a success? If your metric is the reduction of numbers, then yeah, of course. Overnight. Should that be our metric? No. Should the deal be a means to an end? Yes. Have we moved towards that end? No, we haven't even formulated what that should be. At the time, people justified it by saying, we'll make a deal with the devil in order to give ourselves time to reform internally and, boost our resilience. What have we done? We've created a series of buffers. Germany's buffered back to Austria. Austria's buffered into the Balkans. The Balkans have buffered into Greece. The Greeks have buffered into the island. The mayors on the island say we're not going to expand the size of the reception camps, because then will become a permanent solution. So we're going to keep 8,000 people in camps built for 2,000 or 3,000. We're not making use of the deal either, meaning that we don't send people back to Turkey, and when reluctantly we take people off the islands onto the mainland, so they fall out of the deal. When I was there, the Coast Guard said, basically, we don't have secure communications on the island. That means that Turkish smugglers and possibly the government have cracked our communications. If we move 100 people off the islands, then 100 people will turn up the next day, shipped in from Turkey, in order to show, we can control the situation. There's violence in the camps, I saw that myself. There are protection rackets, and because people aren't moving enough, you're getting every wave of the Middle Eastern conflict coming in and getting layered up in these hotspots. We have bought ourselves time to do nothing as far as I'm concerned, and the situation on the island really scares me.
So the EU-Turkey deal is a success in one sense and a failure in another. Yeah. And then, because you're well placed to answer this, we discussed, the question was asked about, has it unbalanced our relationships with essentially a partner who is no longer really our partner, Turkey?
Okay.
Does it unbalance EU-Turkey relations? I think that would be a fair.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, look, two things maybe I'd say there. One is that we think of Turkey as sort of highly strategic in its use of this deal, and it's not. Its interests are really ambivalent. It can talk about opening the floodgates, but it's positioned itself internationally as a humanitarian actor, so letting people die.
It's the world's largest refugee hosting state at the moment.
Okay, and so there's an ambivalence there. As I say, if it threatens to open its border to Europe, we saw during the Caravan of Hope in March, when 50,000 people moved north in Turkey towards the EU border, more than 1 million moved towards the Syrian border with Turkey. So if they open that border, they create a draw. So there's a much bigger draw there, but they do the same to us. They look at us as very strategic. So last time I was in Ankara, they said, you accuse us of weaponizing migration. That's actually what you've done to us. We noticed that when you set up the military operation in the Mediterranean, it coincided with the destabilization of Turkey because, flows came through, started coming through Turkey. We think you did that using your naval operation, which is nonsense. But if you set up a naval operation, then the smuggling networks will change their model. They'll stop facilitating middle-class Syrians to cross the central Mediterranean into Italy and appeal to a mass African market, and your Syrians will go through Turkey. So you've got this funny thing on both sides that we both look at each other as highly strategic, and we're not. We're just kind of reacting to each other.
So that's suspicious minds on both.
Suspicious minds. So is there some sort of grand strategic rebalancing? No, we're just looking at each other and we're not communicating, so we're both tying each other in knots.
But you did say that they're well aware, or at least someone is well aware on the other side when 100 people get moved. So
it's true, but what does that bring? I mean, it's this tiny little game. What would they actually act upon? If you're Greek, people again see that in highly strategic terms. The Aegean is on a geopolitical fault line. Look at these games that Turkey's playing, and you can see the games. But how would Turkey actually act upon that? Does it help with its territorial ambitions? No, it's just eroding relations between the two. It's creating mistrust. So it's
okay.
It doesn't bring anything.
I know that there is a literature on the weaponization of the refugee question, which is I found quite interesting in the middle of the crisis. But I think what I take away from Roderick's answer is they'd like to, if they could, but it's too clumsy a tool to use strategically. Yeah. But they might be using it tactically. And of course, a lot of the increase in asylum seekers these days is Turks fleeing the regime. Eva, do you want to say if the Turkey deal is a success or not? Okay. Dana?
Maybe one sentence. I will not repeat what everyone said because their answers were quite comprehensive and good. I think that the EU-Turkey agreement is not like a magical wand with which you can erase all the problems related to migration. Temporarily, it is a success, but I think much more effort should be put into tackling the origins of the crisis. And there comes the argumentation of Professor Wivel about superpowers and small states looking what the other states' superpowers are doing. Here we need a more comprehensive approach to tackle the origins of the crisis and not just to rely on Turkey. So temporarily, yes, but in the long run, no.
But it's fair to say the EU-Turkey deal is a very good deal for small states.
Oh, it is.
Further up the route.
Yeah, it is.
Audun, do you want to depart from your government's official policy and comment on the EU-Turkey deal?
Don't think so. But I can tell you that quite many years since I was myself operating in the border of Turkey and Greece, and we saw at that time, 7-8 years ago, that they were not cooperating. That was for sure, and we could actually clear signs of when people were coming, when they were patrolling, and so on. And it was not like NATO member operating in close to another neighbor NATO country. It was nothing like no relationship like it should have been. But on that, I'm not going to comment on.
No, well, I will also comment because I was involved, and therefore I would say, to me, if you're going to get rid of that deal, you have to say what's going to replace it, because it totally revolutionized the cooperation that wasn't there before. And things were done when we were having this conversation at the beginning. Things were done in the crisis that would be very hard to do now that people perceive there isn't a crisis. Like we wouldn't get that deal today. So we have to replace it with something, otherwise it's going to be back to chaos. Would be my only. I don't have a comment on whether it's good or bad. It's what happens in these situations. So I'm going to send all of the panel back to their seats because my legs are hurting. So it means that they must be really bad. Sorry, and with a big round of applause. That worked surprisingly well, I thought. So I believe now that Baldur is going to say a few words to sum up and reflect on the day's events.
Thank you very much, Hugo, for being such an excellent chair. Thanks for strong presentations and excellent discussions, panel discussions. And I was particularly pleased with the strong focus on smallness and small states, and how we link basically practice with theory, and we're going to do that to a greater extent tomorrow. Just 2 points in the end, which I would like us to take into tomorrow. First, a question: are we maybe in danger of underestimating the flow of refugees from 2015 as a European crisis situation? Have we maybe forgot, basically I would say all the crises this situation, if I call it so, created? Some people argue we can blame the flow of refugees or the Brexit on the flow of refugees. Rise of right-wing extremist parties all over Europe, especially in Eastern Europe. The EU was, at least it looked for the outsiders, almost like being torn apart by the crisis. And this affected domestic politics in all EU member states, from local government to central governments. And I think we are as well in danger of looking at the smaller units in the smaller member states, like local authorities, agencies, small agencies that had to deal with the flow of asylum seekers. And then, of course, there is, and maybe if this is a crisis situation, maybe it has not ended. Maybe you're just seeing the start of it. If we think about the rise of right-wing extremists in Europe, you're not really sure yet where it's going to end. And if it is related, which it is definitely, partly at least, related to the flow of asylum seekers, then it looks like, at least to me, as a crisis situation. And then to my second point, smallness, small states and big states. Great discussions about this in the panel. I'm not going to provide any answers. Of course, as you mentioned, it was mentioned, the origin of the crisis is created outside of Europe. So basically, the small states are dealing with crises created outside of Europe. They look to me, the small states, as very reactive in the whole discussions. And if they try to be active, like Hungary, they seem to be kicked back. So are they basically small states, more or less dealing, again, as you see in other policy fields, with problems created outside their own borders and decisions taken in Berlin, the biggest EU member state. And they simply have to react to decisions taken outside their own borders. And for many people in small states, this can look as a pretty serious thing. If you add it to that they have to implement policies that are made in Brussels, Hugo is saying they are not made in Brussels, they are made in member states. And where are they made in member states? They are made in the big member states. So just few thoughts for tomorrow. And tomorrow we are especially going to look at the administrative level, how our small states, or some of the small states, coped or tried to cope at home with this so-called crisis situation. We will start the day by Kulli is going to present the analytical framework of the project or of the book. Then we look at these cases with an administrative perspective, I can say so. And in the end, Anders is going to talk about theoretical lessons we can learn from our cases. Because I think even though I learned a lot today, and this was extremely informative, I still think there are quite many unanswered questions for our small states. Thanks for an excellent day. I'm looking forward to tomorrow.